Hello, welcome to the 50-minute podcast, 50-minute hour. There we go. Yeah. I'm Corey. Today I'm joined by Calvin, Jacob, Nate, and Seraphim from the last episode. Today our thing, or whatever you want to call it, is on perennialism. And we'll get to that in a second, but first let's talk about what we are dining on. I'm having some wine and flan made by one of Seraphim's monk friends. It's very good. Thanks to him. Can I say his name?
Let's not.
Okay.
It's a special it's a special recipe that in his words is a salvific sweet for the worthy, but a fiery coal for the unworthy. And it's a special recipe, and it's quite good, so hopefully we are worthy.
Thank you, monk.
And what are we drinking? We're all drinking the same thing. I'm not really sure what it is. Corey, what did you make for us today?
Nate said he wanted a refreshing drink, so I made a cocktail that's like cucumber, lemon, lime, some Saint Germain's, gin, vodka, lots of gin and vodka, some mint, some lavender, some simple syrup made from the lavender from my garden, mints from my garden too. And then I put some Fever Tree elderflower seltzer in there.
And did you make up that recipe, or did you?
Yeah,
I
just made it up on the spot. Yeah,
it's very good, very good. So what exactly are we talking about today?
Well,
Corey?
yeah, like I said, perennialism. I understand your friend Hank from our tarot podcast actually had a question regarding this, and I think that would be a good place to anchor us. Do you want to say what the question was?
Yeah. So to summarize the question in a very easy way, every religion has shared stories, or at least shared similar stories. Stories like Jonah and the whale are shared by a lot of religions at the same time. And his question was, like, for a Christian, how do they know that their religion is the right one? Or someone who practices Islam, how do they know theirs is the right one? And how do all these stories kind of tie together? What is the explanation for that?
Yeah, I mean, the fun part is that you don't know which one's right. And I don't think you can really have knowledge at all. You know, I'm a skeptic. I talked about that in the first episode. But in a weird sense, religious knowledge is both the most foundational knowledge. It's from which, whether or not you acknowledge it, it's the knowledge by which all other knowledges are produced and contained and prescribed by. Even atheism operates in a metaphysics. Almost always, it's a Christian metaphysics. So
what exactly do you mean by that?
So I think I mentioned this before, but basically, like, atheism historically, with some very weird few exceptions, and it's debatable whether or not it's actually atheism, doesn't really develop until you get Christianity. And there have been theories for why that is. In my opinion, it's because Christianity, its sort of unique claim to a religion is how articulate is not the best word, how intense it became ontologically with God, which, Eastern Christians would actually see as a deviation, because we were all about the non-ontological aspect of God, or God being beyond ontology. But at least in the West, which is where you see atheism coming from, and if you read Dostoevsky novels, he definitely harps on this. Atheism is a Western European invention. For Dostoevsky, it's an invention of Catholicism. It's a segment of Catholic theology, and it's the apex of Catholic theology. If you read Paul Tillich, the Protestant theologian, I think he kind of is harping on that same thing as well. And there's traces of that in Heidegger. But basically, like, and this is Nietzsche's thing too, like you kill God because you so ontologized him. And that basically just means you've made him so coherent or mundane to being that the next move you have is, someone like Descartes, who's just saying, like, well, basically the only thing I need God for is to justify that I exist and that the world is at my command. And, it's this dualistic, like, there's me and everything is this, like, outpouring, kind of what we talked about in the last podcast on self. Nature is simply something that is meant to be a tool or the bitch of man, and he uses science to conquer it. That really all is an outgrowth of Western theology. And we talked about that in another podcast too. But basically, like, atheism does not come about in a vacuum. It's not ex nihilo, right? Atheism has to have a metaphysics that first purports God to such high specific ontological examination that you can even begin to get the idea that you could just reject it. This is a problem in every area, but I think it's a particular problem with moderns, because Moderns like to think they're very intelligent, and they're more intelligent than every other era. And I think that's extremely dangerous, but it's probably the great sin of modern people. And one of the things you do with that hubris is that you don't really realize how much your thinking is actually ingrained and affected by all the people before you that you often, on the surface level reject. But a part of this is not understanding that atheism, in order to even operate as a philosophical ideology, requires the years, the hundreds and thousands of years that have gone into Greek philosophy, that fed into patristics, that fed into Christianity, that fed into the Catholic Church, that fed into Protestantism. You can't just invent. It's not like you can just be a guy. And that's another thing with moderns, is that we kind of just think of, like, especially like the analytic tradition, you kind of just like to think that thoughts form in a vacuum without historical context. And that's extremely hubristic and blind. And it's not how the history of ideas actually works. We're not gods in that sense. We can't just think of ideas out of nowhere. And even the ancients understood that if an idea like that did pop into your head, it wasn't from you. It was either from some demon or angel. You didn't really know, but it definitely wasn't from you. It was from an actual God. But, right. So I'm not sure if I'm getting to all of Hank's question yet, but I guess I would say there are, so on one hand, the more you study religions, especially esoteric aspects of religions, the more it's not just the myth stories, although those are definitely overlapping, and we could get into reasons as to why.
What do you mean the myth stories?
So what we talked about in that podcast, Myth of History, right? Which isn't to say that they didn't happen, but I mean simply that they carry this archetypal value system that is actually much higher than history.
Okay.
More real than history. And, things like Noah's flood or the creation story, why are these things why do all these cultures believe in giants and dragons, even though they were all separated, in terms of time and space? Why do they all just come up with the same myth, right? And you can basically either ignore that or take the sort of bullshit Jungian approach to it, or just say actually giants and dragons actually existed, right? There's kind of like your three options.
What is the bullshit option exactly?
The bullshit, the Jungian bullshit. And well, by Jungian bullshit, I mean, it's not to disparage Jung, because there's a degree to which Jung himself isn't guilty of this. But a lot of people sort of cover over this by saying, it's the same mistake I think Kant makes. It's like you say, well, okay, there's this category of dragon in the mind, an archetype of the dragon. Jordan Peterson definitely does this a lot. And you project that out onto the world in myths and histories. And it's like, well, okay, that's fine. It's the same thing with Kant's categories. It's like, for Kant, you have these categories in your mind that allow you to perceive reality. And those are the things that participate nominally that you're projecting onto a phenomenal world. And again, with Kant and Jung, I say, well, that's all fine. But Kant doesn't want to have any proof of God. He doesn't want to have any inductive, intuitive idea of God beyond pure pietistic faith. And Jung's kind of coming out of that tradition, even though he wouldn't acknowledge it. But for Jung, it's like, and this isn't so much a critique of Jung per se as it is Jungians like Jordan Peterson, that, well, okay, if all these cultures have dragon stories, all these cultures have giant stories, that's because it's a category or an archetype they're projecting onto reality. And to both, I say, okay, but where does that category come from? Why, out of all things, in Jordan Peterson's case, why would evolution over millions and millions of years produce something like this idea of a dragon? I could see maybe that happening because it's like a lizard with wings that breathes fire. Maybe happening like one or two cultures that are very closely, related to each other in history and space. But that isn't what you get. You get these cultures coming up with dragon stories.
You get them everywhere.
Yeah, you get them everywhere.
And like with a flood myth. You get flood myths everywhere.
Myth, right. So you can't just relativize this psychologically. And this Jung does do, not to the same degree many of his fans do, but he just tries to psychologize all these things. And the problem is that this is a German idealist error, which, Jung being of that philosophic heritage isn't surprising, which is that you just sort of take everything in the mind and think that's the real thing, and that everything outside is not real. And in a weird way, that's actually kind of true, but not in the way they're trying to go for it, because there's actually something above both of those. And a lot of people want to stick with this sort of secular, boring, mundane, pseudo-atheism, and they don't want to think about anything that's actually has a law over both of those things, over the reality and the mind. And the problem is, it's not that reality is an illusion and the mind is real. It's not the mind is an illusion and reality is real. That's like the materialist view. It's that they're both illusionary. And what really exists when you get rid of all the bullshit is just the pleroma of man and God, and that everything else in the middle is kind of illusionary. or I should just say beings or Dasein, angels. Even Heidegger says that an angel is a Dasein. God does not have Dasein. It's God and Dasein. That's all there is. If you want to be in a Heideggerian sense, everything else in between is bullshit. It's technology.
Dasein being.
That's it's very hard. I'm making this reference for the people who are more familiar with Heidegger. If I had to describe it, it's any being that has awareness of its beingness.
Okay.
And
so like consciousness or a conscious soul, maybe.
So Heidegger would not extend it to, say, a turtle, really. Now, he would say a turtle has being, but he doesn't have Dasein. So what does it mean, for instance? He likes to work in negation. So, for instance, Heidegger will say God does not have Dasein. Angel has Dasein. Man has Dasein. So what does that mean? We basically have two categories of beings that have Dasein, angels and man. Well, if you think about that, you basically get this point where, okay, so what Heidegger's trying to get at is this idea that they have awareness of their being creatures. And the saints will talk about how even animals actually have this in a weird way. Like animals, they have their own operations in nature that are actually praising the creator. So even that language, Heidegger's not trying to be theologically, traditional here, but if you want it to be within a Heideggerian perspective, I would say that the specific Dasein that is unique to man and angels is specific in such a way that their beingness or their imago Dei allows them a very particular relationship to the creator that is unique and special to them. And unique and special to them in such a way that they have a special amour or union with the Godhead that the animals don't.
Heidegger doesn't really talk about the soul much, though, doesn't he?
No, he does.
Oh, he does?
He talks quite a lot about the soul.
He talks about the will, I know a lot.
Yeah. But this is like because with the German, it's so rich. It's the same problem with translations of Freud into English.
Well, say like just more refers to life force, like the German word for soul. Then
because
we have this differentiation and like Anglo.
These things themselves come from such a long history of philosophy and German philosophy. That's why it's very difficult to read Heidegger without having the prerequisite philosophical education. I mean, you can. It's just hard.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to misunderstand what exactly... Same reason and this is why certain thinkers like Freud are so deceptive, because you can think you're understanding Freud, but if you don't really have good context or history or a teacher to try to clue you in on it, especially if you're using like an English translation, you're going to get very confused over what Freud is actually talking about. But this is true with a lot of philosophy in general. But I'm just saying this in particular case to Heidegger and Freud for similar reasons, that these words they're using have a lot of tradition of what they're building upon that don't really relate immediately to what our understanding as 20th, 21st century English speakers are going to understand by it.
So you said at the beginning you don't know your religion's right, correct?
Well, I said in the first podcast I don't know anything. But I'm skeptical of people who say they know. I mean, that knowledge, if you want to go by St. Simeon, is possible, but it's not something that comes through reason. That's something that comes from empirically witnessing the light of God. That is an empirical experience.
So how do you think someone should go about like choosing a religion to follow? If they all have these similar stories, how should someone sort through which one that they find most valid? Is it the practices they like the most, or what exactly?
It's so hard to speak so generally on something like this.
Okay.
I can say your most safest bet is practicing asceticism, because what asceticism does in the right context, and doing this with a spiritual father or spiritual elder, is that it cleans your biases, it cleans your passions that are going to inevitably distort your reason. Your reason is always a product of your passions, and that's why when you're totally purified, you don't even need reason. You don't need your passions. You have a pure noetic apprehension of the one, as the Platonists will say. And the God Plato is talking about is basically the God of all religions, the creator. We talked about this in, I think, Myth of History, with the bullshit dichotomy between polytheism and monotheism, that even these so-called polytheistic religions ultimately have one creator. So there's the one is from which all other gods and beings emanate, and they all go back to the one. This is origin, especially. Having the noetic connection to the one, though, requires, in Neoplatonism called theurgy, requires a very specific practice. But what's interesting with theurgy and Neoplatonism is that when you're reading these Neoplatonists who are not familiar with something like, say, Confucianism, Taoism, or Buddhism, or at least directly, if you read Hans Jonas, The Gnostic Religion, there's some very interesting theories there about how, things like Buddhism may be influenced, or I should really say Moses' revelation from God influenced the Buddhist, which in turn influenced Greco-Roman philosophy. But in either case, that both before and after, religions founded before and after Neoplatonism, the processes described by the Neoplatonists are basically universally applicable. And this is because Plato is going off the Hermetic tradition of Hermes Trismegistus. So, which is to say, it's the purification or the pure substance of the one true religion, the perennial faith. You know, you take someone like Evela, well, that's a religion that was in Hyperborea, died out, and now all the religions are just, you know, sort of sputterings of it. You know, some getting closer to it than others. And this is an important distinction to make as well. It's like the sort of bullshit New Age perennialism, which is basically just nihilism with extra steps. Because what's that saying is like where everything is basically the same level of truth. Therefore, which is just kind of bullshit because at least on the surface level, most religions contradict each other. So you have this very surface level of that. And that just leads to this sort of passive aspect of truth. Well, if everything is basically the same, everyone's saved, it doesn't really matter, we can just do whatever we want. And which even then, it's like most religions have hell. You know, maybe they're not eternal, but it's something you still want to take seriously. Yeah. And then there's the more actual traditional idea of perennialism, which is that there is one true religion, and that may or may not have been revealed yet, right? So you might say Muhammad revealed the one true religion, or Christ revealed the one true religion, or, you know, Salih, you know, Selassie with Rastafarianism, right? Haile Selassie, yeah. Or L. Ron Hubbard or whatever, okay. But the point is that what you find distilled in the perennial religion, which is to say Neoplatonism, or Hermes Trismegistus, Hermeticism, that is the conduit by which you can connect and study all the religions. A later iteration of this, which I don't really like, and I don't want to go into too much why, is Theosophy. Theosophy is trying to scientize Hermeticism in this very, like, sort of, in my opinion, arrogant modern Western way of doing that. And the whole, like, you know, Rudolf Steiner and all that sort of came out of that. And but really the more Hermetic tradition is what I'm speaking of in this situation with Neoplatonism. And when you're reading, if you really study a religion in depth, and then you study other religions in depth, the more you study them in depth, it's not the more different they become, it's the more alike they become. Now, that doesn't mean that the salvific or soteriological consequences are of no point. You actually begin to understand that it's of paramount to, you know, quote unquote, have the right religion. But the right religion in principle is a person, at least from a Christian point of view, which is the Logos. And if you read St. Justin Martyr in his second apology, the Logos which Christ manifests is the Logos by which all of reality is emanated by and created within. You know, in Genesis, right? God creates through Christ, through the Holy Spirit. The entire world is a stamp of Christ. So even the pagans worshiping nature are actually worshiping Christ. Now, they might not be worshiping the fulfillment of Christ, right? But in the same way, Plato, Socrates, Lao Tzu, Confucius, when even Confucius in his humility saying, I do not know what the mandate of heaven is. I merely know the laws it emanates, okay? So when you're getting at that level, all they're saying is like, look, there's obviously an ultimate law or logos. I may not know it. Socrates says he doesn't really know it. Plato doesn't seem to claim to know it, although he tries to play around to lead you to it. Confucius says he doesn't really know it. Lao Tzu plays around with it. None of them are really claiming to know it. And then you get the prophets like Muhammad, you know, so on, and all the, you know, Moses. These are people who are claiming to do what St. Simeon says you get, which is the actual empirical, noetic apprehension of the divine light of God. Moses gets that in the fire at the bush, where he sees the backside of God. All right, Muhammad gets that through the fire of the angel, where, you know, because you wouldn't say God manifests himself directly in Islam, but the closest thing would be the light coming from Gabriel in the Revelations.
So would all these religions worship the same God just with different names and practices? Is it the same?
I mean, Middle Eastern Christians
God?
call God Allah. Right?
Okay.
So quite literally to your question, yes. But the deeper thing to understand is that the word God is not God. The word God is a name. There is not a name of God unless you're talking about the second person of the Trinity from the Christian point of view. If you get into Kabbalah, God has 72 names, from which the 72 cards of the tarot derived. Okay, so that you're getting into a lot of other crazy esoteric stuff there. But properly speaking, if even in a mystical sense, even those 72 names of God, or even Christ himself, this is actually a huge controversy on Mount Athos at one point. Even the very name of Christ himself, God is ultimately transcendent and beyond all those things. But we would say Christ is probably the thing that comes closest, or Jesus really. Christ is just, again, a title. Jesus is a personal name. Christ just means the anointed one, the Messiah. So Jesus is the personal name. And even then, all these names have meanings too, right? In the way they even serve as titles. But the names themselves are not God. God is beyond language. And if you get too attached to the name, you get too attached to the language, that actually gets you away from God.
So the idea of God, though, it wouldn't be the same, right?
It's the same in some ways. And again, what I was saying earlier is that the deeper you get in religion, the more you get past the superficialities and sort of the exoteric stuff that, some people might say are for the masses. The more you begin to realize that they're essentially talking about the same God.
Okay.
Now, of course, someone can make like a sort of smart-ass point, pointing to Christ on the cross, asking a Muslim, is this God? Well, of course, the Muslim's going to say no. But that's sort of not being intellectually honest with the actual deeper problem, which, of course, is that Christians have a Trinity, and the God we're really talking about here is God the Father, not God the Son. Of course, they don't believe in God the Son as being God, right? Although they still have Christ in a very high reverence as the one who comes back in the apocalypse to divide the good and the evil.
So all that being said, how would we differentiate that then from like modern ecumenism, where you have people that like would argue that Christians, Muslims, and Jews all worship the same God?
So modern ecumenism is actually anti-perennialist. And what I mean, a true perennialist is not trying to water down religions superficially so that they all seem to look the same. That's what an ecumenist does. A perennialist says, obviously, religions have different practices, and it's important. Most perennialists will say that, God reveals himself to each people, all the 72 nations, with a specific practice that's unique to their race and unique to their place geographically. And that is what is best for them to connect to the All-Father, to the One, to God, to Yahweh, to Allah. Okay, what ecumenism tries to do is this very Western imperialistic sort of arrogant idea that, in the past 200 years, white people have kind of, usually it's white people, not always, sort of got the idea of God, finally right. And we're going to have to like nitty gritty do some bureaucratic, management on all the religions to make them all basically bleed into the same thing. That is not perennialism. That is making religion this really weird gray blob that has this eerie totalitarian service means to it. Like make everyone like get along and we all believe in the same thing and there's no longer any racial or heritage distinction. We're basically all the same people and we can all be ruled by one person because we're all the same now. Yay, Antichrist. So no, that's bullshit. That's not real perennialism. That's the problem a lot of people have with this is that when you say perennialism, they think ecumenism, even though true perennialism is in total opposition to ecumenism. Perennialists want distinction in religion because they understand that the seed of religion is something that emanates itself uniquely to each race, to each tribe of man. Which I will say, too, is one reason I do like orthodoxy, because orthodoxy so well adapts itself. And Catholicism has done this here and there, though recently it's kind of gotten a bad track record. But orthodoxy so well adapts itself to the practices and the culture. It's like the Tao. It's like the Tao's like water. It's always in the lowest place. And when you're in the lowest place, you take the form of whatever you're encapsulated by. That's like orthodoxy is like the Tao. This is higher McDomasine, right? You go into the lowest place when you go to a culture and you don't force your ideas on them. You don't try to imperialize them into your culture of Britain or Spain or whatever. You simply give them the way, which is what they call the way. The Chinese translations in the Orthodox Bibles, they just take the way of Christ and say the Tao. That the way forms itself in such a way that it allows itself to be adjusted while maintaining the Logos, which is manifested in a person named Christ historically. But if you look at their icons, it's always like, Jesus is Japanese, Mary is Chinese, whatever. So the real Tao, the real Logos, insofar it emanates as a true form, nonetheless takes on the mask or the personae of what is necessary for the culture it's in.
Touching a bit more on that. I don't really know how much evangelism exists outside of Christianity and like Islam, but given kind of what you said about, okay, the Logos revealing itself to each culture in the way it can best like understand and, worship it or however, how does evangelism fit in either, like I said, in the Christian context or, Muslim context or any other sort of religion that has a concept of evangelism? Is that inherently problematic or is there a way to How would that be understood?
It's not inherently problematic. It's problematic historically because it got wrapped up in imperialism. What evangelism is, it is the charity to share truth. And humans have this instinct. Unfortunately, most of the time it becomes egoistic and arrogant. And it's merely this idea of sharing my personal truth and forcing it on other people through debates or war or whatever. But that is actually all a ramification of a pure godly desire, which is to share the revealed truth of religion. And you evangelize in such a way that you take what a person already knows to be true and you give them the logos onto that. And again, this is what orthodoxy historically has done so well in evangelism, is that it's not destroying. It doesn't go into China like a lot of Protestant evangelists will. It doesn't go into China. It's like, you got to get rid of this Taoism, this Confucianism. It's all demonic. Orthodoxy says a lot of what you have here is basically true, but it's all revolving. It's all an emanation of Christ. So true evangelization is putting the logos in the keyhole of the door that's already there. It's not breaking down the door.
So is the best evangelism more like symposium rather than teaching, more discussion of ideas?
Symposium would be great for a culture of, well-read literati French American people, but that's probably not going to do very great in like Africa or like China, right? You adopt to the culture you're in.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
But I do think in general, and this is Plato too, like parties are a great way to sow truth.
So are you a fan of like the people who go up on the street and start trying to tell people about Jesus in the Bible?
I think that just pushes people away.
Okay.
With rare exception. And again, in a certain culture that kind of works. But I think the problem, the Protestant mindset is often like one size fits all. And that is just, it's terrible because again, it's this arrogant modernist idea that like everyone is basically like me. And they receive truth the same way I received it. Like I was, it's usually this coming to God sort of story. Like I was a drunkard, I was sleeping around, and then I found God at the bottom of a beer glass or something. And so now I have to, and then like hell really scared me. So now I got to push the fear of hell onto everyone, right? It's like that generally does. In fact, for most people, just fear mongering pushes them away. Now the Bible says that, right? That the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. But the fear of God is not this, as the fathers will say, it's not really the servile fear. It's like, if I don't obey God, I'm going to go to hell. It's more so, better really translated as awe in many cases. It's this stunning awe of all creation and how seemingly insignificant you are, and yet how at the same time, as Augustine says, speaking of invention of the self, God is closer to us than we are to ourselves at the same time, despite being in this mass of creation that is just Lovecraftian and confusing. And if you think about it too much, you'll go insane.
I know that like in Japan, for instance, this is one of the reasons I think Christianity kind of failed. It's because the Jesuits come and they start talking about Christ and whatnot. And the Japanese are very receptive to it. And they're like, oh, well, what about all our ancestors who died before you came? Like, they're all just burning in hell.
Saint Xavier really messed that one up.
Yeah. So.
Are they not burning in hell?
Well, if you ask Saint Xavier, and to be fair, Saint Xavier is just teaching what the Catholic Church taught at that time. Orthodox are also burning in hell. So basically, unless you submit to the Pope, I'm not exaggerating, this is literally a dogmatic council. Unum Sanctum. This is the Pope who wrote this was the one that pissed off Dante. Unum Sanctum, which is it's a papal infallible doctrine, which technically as a Catholic you have to submit to, even though the Catholic Church no longer teaches this.
Although you have Mel Gibson is very adamant that Unum Sanctum still stands.
Yeah, he's right.
He's like, my wife is a much better Christian than me, but she's going to hell because she's not Catholic. And I'm like, all right, well, at least he's consistent.
Is she Protestant?
So, yeah, she's Anglican. But he's convinced. He's like, yeah, I'm a terrible guy, but I'm Catholic, so I'm going to heaven, and she's not.
Unless you die submitting to the Pope, which includes Pope Francis, you will go to hell.
So in your personal opinion, where are like the Japanese ancestors? Like, would they be in a Catholic stance like some sort of purgatory? Or is it just unknown to us?
In the modern Catholic stance, yes.
In your stance, though,
in my stance,
in your opinion.
Yeah, I think pretty much unless you're like a saint, everyone goes into purgatory.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not Toll Houses?
And no, it's Toll House, but Toll House is. I haven't been through the Toll Houses. I don't know if it's like literally you're like this trucker on like some soul bike and you're just like coming up to some mustache demon who's like, all right, you got to pay the toll fee. It's like, and you're like, oh no, not another toll fee. And then your guardian angel is like, wait, stop, no. He didn't actually do this. He only did this, and this, and this, and maybe a little of that. But he didn't do this, what you're saying here in Article 75 of blah, blah. I don't think it happens like that. I think the toll houses are more like a pedagogical tool to understand the intensity of the weight of sin in relation to what that means in your next life. Because all the sins we have here, even the ones you confess or whatever, they sort of just kind of go into this abyss of memory. And when your soul departs from the body, everything, this is what Freud says, although not in a spiritual sense, but you remember everything, whether or not you consciously remember it. And this is actually a deep spiritual truth, as much as Freud would hate to hear that. But when you leave, your intelligence is no longer weighed down by the slimy organism that is your brain. And as much as moderns would hate to hear it, your brain is not the seat of intelligence. It's merely the organ that communicates intelligence in a physical body. So when your soul leaves, it's leaving your brain. So your intelligence is now purified. And that not purified in the divine sense, but it's purified in the sense it's not weighed down by this meaty organ that has disease and degeneration and subject to, varying levels of neurogenesis. So when that happens, your memories and processes and understanding of everything is you get 20/20 vision, you get 20/20 memory, and everything forward and backward, time kind of becomes this blob that doesn't really make linear sense anymore. It's like reading, Slaughterhouse-Five or something. The Tralfamadorians, everything's this four-dimensional enterprise. And your memories are suddenly crystal clear back and forth. So you don't have any lapse. And with that also comes this intense emotional, spiritual weight of the sins you've committed. And that's literally weighing you down in the progress of getting your soul up. Probably your soul is actually going to go down. So you're gonna have to, burn it out a bit, sweat it out. But yeah.
Why do so many Christian denominations reject the idea of like a purgatory?
Yeah,
Why
I've
is
talked
that?
about this before. This was kind of a Protestant thing where you just assume that if something sounds pagan, it means it's wrong, which basically it's this strong anti-perennialism. This is
Okay.
also why Protestants evangelize in a very anti-perennial way, because the whole Protestant mindset is the Catholic Church is wrong. And the Catholic Church is wrong because it was too tied to all this pagan stuff.
Okay.
When the truth is actually Justin Martyr's point, which is that no, paganism and Christianity are basically the same thing. Christianity is the pure religion that is the revelation of what all the pagans were getting at. It's not like Christ comes and suddenly destroys the pagan religions. Rather, Christ comes and fulfills it. He puts the iota on top of the dot on top of the I. And it's precisely that all the pagan religions have a belief in hell and purgatory, right? It's also very selective. Like Protestants don't look at the fact that all pagans have an idea of hell and then say, well, hell must be pagan, therefore reject it. They're very selective with these things. And to them, it seems like the Catholic Church invented purgatory, which it definitely did. It invented certain doctrines about purgatory that are not historical. But all the early Christians had an idea of purgation. And in fact, their hell and purgation was the same. The reason this doesn't really seem like a problem in Orthodoxy is because we never had to invent purgatory. Basically, what happened with the Catholics after Augustine is they're like, there wasn't really a purgatory. It was just kind of like all unbaptized babies go to hell forever. And people were only able to tolerate that for so long. And they're like, okay, wait, we messed up, but we also don't want to say all these people were wrong. So now we're going to do this purgatory thing. But what they were really going off of, as they found out much later, before they did Vatican II, was basically what the Eastern Church Fathers were always talking about, which they couldn't read because they mostly didn't know Greek. But the Church Fathers were always talking, and the early Christians were always going on about purgatory, or what would now be called purgatory in the West. We just understood that whereas the West pretty much separated purgatory from hell, we just never separated the two. They were always the same. Hades is just Hades. Hades is purgatory. Hades is hell. They're one and the same.
I was gonna say, if I were to go to my Orthodox priest right now and ask him do you believe in purgatory? He's gonna say no. But that being said, you go to the Greek Septuagint, you're not gonna see one word for hell in the New Testament. You're gonna see Gehenna, you're gonna see Hades, you're gonna see Tartarus, and there's a distinction between all these things.
And at the end of the day, this is basically mostly pointless historical antagonism, because what Hades is doing is purging you. It is a purgatorial.
It literally translates to
it's
death,
a purgatorial experience. It is a purgatory.
So when and where exactly did this idea of just eternal pain and suffering come from?
It's debated. There seems to be evidence that it was around Second Temple Judaism that the Pharisees, and not even then, it was only a minority of the Pharisees, and they seem to have borrowed it from some obscure pagan source. It wasn't any mainstream pagan idea. And it's really lost where it came from. Some think it's like the Turkish or, what would have been modern day Turkey. But So basically, they were Pharisees who, as Pharisees often do, they were taking certain aspects of these pagan stories very literally and reading it into Old Testament aspects. In the Old Testament understanding, there really isn't this strong idea of conscious suffering that you get in later Jewish and Christian sources. And this minority of Pharisees, it's probably around 2nd century BC, started to champion this idea of eternal punishment. Even early Christianity, this does not seem to be, as we talked about before, the major view. Although being familiar with Judaism, as some of the church fathers were, they were very aware of the idea of eternal suffering. As I talked about in the last podcast, though, around the turn of the 4th century, this started to catch on more as the mainstream view of hell in the Christian religion. But it's ultimately, I would say, it's literally a Pharisaical origin.
Well, I was going to pivot a bit, but we kind of went down a path. Does anyone have anything else on that?
I kind of want to clarify or ask you to clarify something you said earlier. So you talked about how purgatory sort of developed in the Catholic West out of this desire to have a better solution to what happens to unbaptized babies when they die.
Ultimately, not immediately.
Okay,
but sorry, maybe that's what you want me to clarify.
Well, it seems like there are two different concepts that actually play out here. So there's limbo and then there's purgatory, where limbo is something other than purgatory.
Yes, so limbo is the expansion pack on purgatory that came later.
But I thought limbo is what came about to account for what happens to unbaptized babies who die.
It is. These things were not very clear when the Catholics started getting, kind of willy-nilly on this stuff. And they sort of like sat down and thought about this stuff for a while, like, okay, wait, we need to alter this a bit to make sense given all the weird ideas we have about sin and punishment for sin. Because if you want to say that if there is a difference between the Catholic and Orthodox idea of purgatory, it's the hamartiology, and which is just the science of sin. And basically in the Catholic idea, no matter how much you do to get your sins forgiven with however level of contrition, there's God's justice still has to be visited on you. And the purpose of Catholic purgatory, the teleology of Catholic purgatory, from that extension, is to mete out that punishment. Protestants rightly rebelled against this. Outside of Latin-influenced parts of Orthodoxy, like modern Russia, this is not really an Orthodox idea of sin. Sin is not something that needs to be punished. And again, this is what, it's kind of funny because Protestants always see themselves as rebelling against all these Catholic innovations, when the irony is that a lot of what Protestant believes are actually the Catholic innovations themselves, including this idea of this need. This is also where like a lot of the hardcore divine atonement theory comes in, with Christ being this person who God just metes out his wrath on. You can say this originates with Anselm. There are some Orthodox before Anselm that seem to kind of say this view, which is why I don't want to give a hard, that this is a totally Western thing. It's not. I don't know by name. I remember reading it here and there. Generally, if you ask me what name of whatever church father, I'm not going to know, except unless it's like something that St. Simeon said. But the way my brain works is like I'm very bad at remembering names. I'm like a weird library where I just read things and I forget the names and I remember everything that was said. And things that are said by a lot of them in a similar way, I tend to remember much better. But the names just kind of bleed out. Anyways, I just wanted to click, because a lot of times you'll hear like a lot of Orthodox say like divine atonement theory is a purely Western idea. It's not. Now, what is the very extreme form of it, which the Catholics innovated upon and the Protestants basically just continued without challenging. And that's why a lot of Protestants today have this idea that you have to go to hell for eternity so God can mete out his eternal just punishments. And this is just like, even among Orthodox that believe in eternal hell, that's a totally foreign idea.
Limbo also seems to be something other because it's not purgative, correct?
So
there's not really a telos to it.
Again, there are some Eastern Church fathers that do say, and saints that say that there's this weird limbo-like area on the perimeter of heaven where unbaptized children go, unbaptized babies go. But in my opinion, this is probably Latin influenced. I don't think it's original to Orthodoxy. The limbo accelerator. Every Planned Parenthood just adds another like 6,000 miles of the limbo circle around heaven. It's actually a real estate. It's a heavenly real estate company.
Well, this again kind of pivot back to something we were on much earlier. But you were saying that this sort of modern evangelical way of evangelization is very kind of different from the perennial idea. But I feel like I can see how one, especially, they could look back at the scripture in the early church and see the apostles so zealously going out to do lands and be like, aha, look at this Christ, this Christ is better than your gods, and, convert to this and be saved. I mean, there seems to be sort of a line that they can pull from that.
Yes.
And it seems like I can very much see where they get this concept of doing that, and to the idea of even going, actually, we were talking about this before the podcast started, like to college campuses and being like, repent.
Yes.
So is it just like the attitude is different, or the understanding of what converting to Christ does is different?
It's
like, what's
both.
the difference? Okay.
I talked about this in the last podcast, but if you just pick up the Bible and read it today, you're going to have a very different understanding of what those words mean than what the Christians in the early church are meaning. And this was, if you listen to the last podcast, I explained how this applied particularly to soteriology and eternal hell versus apokatastasis or universalism, and why so many early Christians seem to have gone in the latter view. Again, one thing is just being saved just means to be healed, right? It's not like you're being saved from something. And I think when you read it in that light, it's like, oh, you're being saved from hell, or which is to say you're being saved from death, which is true. But the bias of something like saved has a particular idea, again, of like, basically, I'm going to help you get helped by God to escape God's punishment, which atheists will point out is a very valid criticism of that view of soteriology. The other thing is that in traditional Christian view is that going out and thinking you're an apostle and evangelizing is actually a form of prelest. The apostles were given a very particular grace, a very particular fire to do what they did in the way they did it. And in fact, in most traditional Christian communities like the Coptic, you're not supposed to evangelize at all. Only a priest or people who have been given a certain eldership status are allowed to evangelize, because the danger in evangelization is falling into prelest, which is the most damnable sin, and also prelest being like spiritual pride, thinking that you have a certain gift of God that you don't, or especially when you be given visions or thoughts from the devil and you think they're from God, which if you go into evangelization, you're at a high risk of that. And if you see the film Silence, right, with the Jesuits who go into Japan, he's a very good example of that. He falls into this prelest of thinking he's basically Christ or the apostles. And basically in Protestantism, the idea is that everyone is St. Paul. And that's just a petri dish for prelest. Now, Orthodoxy doesn't think that no one should evangelize, but we think you evangelize in your actions rather than words, and mostly through love. As St. Seraphim of Saros says, acquire the spirit of peace, which is to say the Holy Spirit, and 1,000 around you will be converted. Simply worry about your own salvation. Don't judge others. Don't criticize others. Don't complain. Simply work out your salvation in fear and trembling, and 1,000 around you will be converted without you having to do anything. You get the same thing in St. Francis in the West. Simply love others. You don't even need to preach Christ. Your heart will preach Christ to their heart, which is much more powerful than words. You don't need to go to a college campus and push everyone away from Christ by acting like some idiot. Rather, do what you need to do where God assigns you. If you're a student at a college campus, fine, but you probably don't belong on college campus and it's just kind of creepy. Do what you're assigned by God to do, and simply be loving and charitable, and people will wonder how you got like that. And they'll start to think maybe Christ is something other than what that weird preacher was saying when I was in college is. Maybe Christ is someone else. Maybe Christ isn't this hateful person who wants to burn everyone in hell if he produced a person like this person.
Yeah. Well, actually, I really like that. And I think I like your mention to my patron saint on that one, because I think that's absolutely true. And I do recall a conversation I had with a certain Christian who had studied religion formally and had done a lot of research and had jumped around in different traditions. And they actually said that the number one leading thing to get them to Christianity, and it wasn't, they did a lot of reading and scholarship to get there, was just simply someone they knew who was just a very loving person, who was it was some random, evangelical Christian, but was just such a extraordinarily loving and friendly person. And they said there was just something in them that they felt like there was a grace there, and there was something worth, considering if they could be that good of a person. And, kind of goes back to that line, you'll know, they're Christians by their love, yeah. And it's kind of a really quoted thing, but it's actually quite true. And it goes back to what St. Seraphim was trying to get to there,
yes.
I think.
And everyone has different talents. So the way you evangelize is something you have to discern. And for some people, that might mean actually becoming a missionary, but that's very, very few and far between. And again, that's a very spiritually dangerous path. some people, it might mean a very radical, kind of like St. Teresa path. You go into the poorest parts of the world and you serve the poor until you kill yourself, basically, from poverty. And you literally become like Christ. And, thousands in India were converted by her works. So, or you just become, Kierkegaard's Night of Infinite Resignation. You become this simple person who is not an intellectual or an artsy person. You're a normie. You're a normie for Christ. You're a fool for Christ by being a normie. And you just live a very normal, mundane existence, but with the love of Christ constantly radiating in your heart. That's probably what the vast majority of people are called to do, is to have a normal life with a normal job and raise a family, but all doing it with Christ as the reason for why they're doing that. And again, because Christ is the logos, at the heart of it, this is basically what most religions are teaching.
How, and this may be kind of too complicated to answer, especially in the time we have left, but maybe simply speaking, how would, because that would probably be what most people are called for, how would the normie, so to speak, living the normie life, be able to do that and be like, to use our language, initiated, right, into true wisdom and true understanding while still living the relatively normal simple
Well, yeah,
life?
I should clarify, by normie life, I don't mean believing whatever the mainstream media tells you, right? Which is probably what a lot of people think when you hear normie or like blue pill or whatever. By normie, I just simply mean like not standing out, not being a person who stands out from the crowd. That's Kierkegaard's words with the Night of Infinite Resignation. You're merely someone who blends in. You don't stand out, and you kind of like Christ walking through the crowds. You don't really stand out. And yet within you, there's something that radiates spiritually, subtly. And that, without people even being conscious of it, is what converts them to love. We have a minute left. Did anyone have any last questions? Or
I don't. I think we covered it.
Okay. Well, Hank, this was all inspired by your questions. So if you listen to this and have any other questions, please let us know. It was a very good question. Other than that, did you have something, Jacob?
I was just going to say, as always, we do read the comments on the YouTube videos and whatnot. So let us know if you have questions, and we'll definitely discuss them on the podcast. So
We'll see you next time.
see you next time.
See you next time.
Yeah, that.
All right, until next time. Thank you.